So without any further delay, I'd like to invite Professor Taniguchi to the floor. Please welcome Professor Taniguchi.
Thank you, Professor Nakano, for your kind introduction, and thank you very much for getting interested in having me here. And I've been looking forward to meeting you all. Once again, my name is Tomohiko Taniguchi, and I would like to make this opportunity as lively as possible, an interactive session rather than me making any sort of lecture. She told us that I'm working as Shinzo Abe's speechwriter. They say, the members of the Japanese press say, that I wrote such speeches as he delivered, for instance, to the International Olympic Committee gathering in Buenos Aires, Argentina last year, to eventually, with a result, Japan getting won the bidding for the Olympic Games in 2020. And they say that I wrote another speech that he delivered to the Joint House of the Australian Congress. I have never denied, but I have never acknowledged those are true. But since starting to work with Shinzo Abe, let's put it in this way, to broadly frame strategic communications for Shinzo Abe, and given my background that I spent a stint with the Japanese Foreign Ministry, I've been always keen on observing how foreign policy under Shinzo Abe has evolved. But let me just start by saying, or by putting it into doubt, that whether or not Japan can have any peculiar foreign policy under the name of a single politician, like Shinzo Abe. Suppose, for instance, Singapore's diplomacy could alter dramatically under a new leader. Do you have any such room for you to change dramatically your diplomacy? I doubt. By the way, I have been a great admirer of Singaporean diplomacy for many years. Well, in that sense, it's been a one-sided love affair between me and Singapore. With Singapore, or let me put it this way, without Singapore, East Asia Summit, the gathering of wide-ranging countries from India, Australia, New Zealand, couldn't have taken place. Because that was, I think, in the year 2004 or 5, Singapore pushed Japan very hard to actively engage countries like Australia and India. So has been this important gathering of East Asia Summit. Singaporeans' contribution has been enormous for that matter. Singapore's role also was instrumental in launching and maintaining Europe-Asia dialogue, as many of you are aware. EAS has been its consequence. And I cannot talk about Singaporean diplomacy without a single individual who I saw in Washington, D.C. when I was spending my sabbatical at the Brookings Institution. This is between 2004 and 5. The Singaporean ambassador, Madam Chi, that you sent to Washington, D.C. was actually a walking chapter of Singaporean diplomacy. She spent so many years that she became actually dean of the diplomatic corps based in Washington, D.C. So much so, she was attending almost all conferences. So her reputation as well as her network eventually snowballed to the extent that no matter what topics you discuss about Asia, you cannot forget including this single lady from Singapore. In the case of Japanese diplomacy, as is the case, unfortunately, with many other big nations, the rotated fashion with which you change ambassadors is detrimental to the enhancement of your diplomatic purposes. In the case of Japan, the current ambassador, Takeuchi, a good friend of mine, has been in Singapore only for a year or so, and he is doomed to be replaced with someone else in due course. And this due course is very short. So Singapore, perhaps because it's a small nation, the value of human talent is so precious. You cherry pick the best and brightest and give assignments to work in countries where they're supposed to represent Singapore, and for a prolonged period of time. That's the kind of diplomacy I would like to see conducted from Japan. Now, having all this said, Singaporean diplomacy may not be shaped by individuals, but shaped by what Singaporean diplomacy has been shaped and will continue to be shaped primarily by what? I think it's location. Location and location. A familiar PR message that you might hear from realtors or real estate agents. Singapore just happens to be faced with one of the busiest sea traffics in the world. It just sits between India and Australia. That was important many years ago, may not be so, but it will gain salience because the Indian Ocean is going to be a burgeoning area of trade in your lifetime, if not in my lifetime. So Singapore's diplomacy has been shaped with a notion that the country must take advantage of its location as much as possible. Therefore, financial industry, trade, commerce, tourism, these have been among the most important economic factors or industries that you have spent so many years to develop. And I think your diplomacy, therefore, has had to cater to those purposes. The same is true with most of the nations, including Japan. So I doubt if there can be any Shinzo Abe's diplomacy. After all, Shinzo Abe's predecessor, the name of which not many of you remember, Yoshihiko Noda was the name. And if I look back, I can tell you there has been striking little difference between Noda's diplomacy and Abe's diplomacy. He also talked about the salience of India-Japan relationship. He also talked about the need for the country to reactivate something called the right to exercising self-defense collectively. So those are the common factors that are running throughout from the previous administration to the current. And then we have to remember where Japan is. If you think of the map for East Asia or the Indian Ocean, you can see that archipelago, the island nation called Japan, sits on the long tail end of something called the sea lines of commerce that start from the Arabian Gulf region, Persian Gulf region, going through the Strait of Malacca, South China Sea, East China Sea. So the safe passage of these commerce channels, in other words, freedom of navigation, have been and will continue to be among the most important elements that would continue to shape Japan's foreign policy. After the war, the United States, the mega sole superpower after the Second World War, willingly provide the entire nation from the East China Sea through the Indian Ocean with security blanket. Not many people are aware that there is a British territory right in the middle of the Indian Ocean called, who is loaned to the United States, and the United States is using the facility for strategic purposes. But who told us Diego Garcia? Who? Gentlemen, may I ask, under whose control and command strategic squadron in Diego Garcia is operating? Any idea?
US.
I know that's US. Which command and control center geographically located where?
Oh, Honolulu.
Honolulu.
Paycom.
Hmm?
Paycom.
No. It's under the command and jurisdiction of the Yokosuka-based US 7th Fleet. Yokosuka being a city, port city, very close to Tokyo, which is the home port for the forward deployed aircraft carrier battle force the United States 7th Army has had. It's an indication that there has been a degree of sense of responsibility on the side of the United States to continue to provide this whole region, Indian Ocean, the East and South China Seas, with security. Now what is happening? What is happening now? I don't say the United States is a declining power, but even in relative terms, you cannot claim any longer that it's a so gigantic Atlas-like power whose shoulders you can put the entire globe. And in addition to that, the Chinese maritime expansion, naval expansion, has become an element that you all have to take into consideration, like it or not. One should hope that the Chinese naval ambition should be something that would do no harm to the rest of the people, and to be an integral part to provide security once again to the international common goods. That's our hope. But in the meantime, there is an increasing degree of uncertainties. These are all given factors, with or without Shinzo Abe. Let's look at what's happening domestically in Japan. Yes, its economy is still a sizable one. Not necessarily bigger than, but as big as Germany, the United Kingdom combined. Its financial muscle still strong. So you're basically looking at a huge economy. But is it a growing economy? No way. It's losing its population. The population itself is aging. How can you sustain your well-being under these circumstances? The only way for you to sustain your well-being is to try to enhance your labor productivity. The problem is, the Japanese government over the last decades spent a lot of money in boosting its economy in the form of public spendings, government expenditure, and so on. And then you ended up having with this dismal situation. And if you lose your population, the input to your economic system is going to get smaller still in amount. Therefore, you have to grow by growing your labor productivity. Unlike government expenditures and so on, there is no clear, easy to understand, panacea sort of solution to boost your labor productivity. You have to try all sorts of things, ranging from encouraging female labor force to stay in the labor market, encouraging them, if possible, to break the glass ceilings as much as possible, thereby giving new catalyst to Japan's economy, to further opening Japan's economy to the competition of the international global economy. Those are mostly imperatives, again, with or without any single politician. That being the case, I think Japan has a strikingly limited width of options, be it about foreign policy or be it about economic policy. On the foreign policy front, what could be Japan's options? I said, it's not wide-ranging. It ought to be very, very narrow in scope, because after all, Japan's location makes it imperative for Japan to choose one or two from a very limited number of options available. And the option that Japan has been choosing, and I am sure will continue to choose for the future, is this. Not try to do everything alone, by itself. Try to do as much as possible together with someone you can count on. On the security front, it has been, and it will continue to be, its treaty alliance partner of the United States. But gradually, the range of security provision has been made wider by including countries like Australia, India, Indonesia. Singapore's role, for that matter, also has been pivotal, because after all, Singapore is providing mega berth to the US aircraft carrier battle force, littoral battleships. Singapore is willing to accommodate those. That's on the security front. And on the trade front, Japan's pursuing something called TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. If you're interested in where we stand in this issue, I'd be happy to answer your questions later on. So trade liberalization is another. In a nutshell, to put it very much simply, the only option available for Japan is not to close the country from the rest of the world, and instead to keep the country wide open and as connected as possible with the rest of the world. So, if you think that way, the options available for Japan are very much limited in number and width. Then, what is this Shinzo Abe factor, if there is any? I think there has been a very strong factor of Shinzo Abe's, which is as follows. He, after spending mere 20 months in office, covered a net total, not a gross total, but a net total of 49 countries. This is a remarkable global trotter you're now looking at. For what purpose? This is certainly not for fun. Because traveling abroad, mostly using weekends, is itself very much a burdensome, tiresome job to do, and yet he's done that. I think it's because he has felt it to be necessary for the nation's space, economic space, geoeconomic space, geopolitical space, trade space to be expanded. And by so doing, try to help boost Japan's economy, and then try to boost or mend your self-esteem. This is something that I should brought home to you, because you don't know anything about dwindling economic prolonged malaise. After all, Singapore is a walking epitome, isn't it, of the narrative of rags to riches. Your per capita GDP has long surpassed that of Japan, or for that matter, that of the UK, and so on. Yet, in my country, Japan, the country once was very much proud of their own accomplishment, has had this prolonged economic malaise someone calls lost 2 decades. Many of you in this auditorium, I would say, are under the age of 40. But people under the age of 40 in Japan have experienced no such thing as growth. So when we were in our home, on our way home from Buenos Aires, Argentina, after winning the bid for the Olympic Games in 2020, we stopped over in Los Angeles for refueling, and I got an email from one of my female students who is in her late 20s, and she told me that how glad she was looking at the winning of the bidding for the Olympic Games, and she said she gave an email to her fiancé, a Japanese man working in East Timor as a member of the NGO, and she says that they ended up talking about what they would be doing in 6-7 years' time when this great party is going to take place in Tokyo, and they ended up talking about that they will have a baby or 2. So she said to him that let's us take those babies, a baby or 2, over to the newly renovated Olympic Stadium. And he told her, this is very much a cautious person, he told her, wait a minute, it's going to be very much congested. And she answered by saying, what's the matter with that? We could carry our baby like this or like that. And that was the moment, Professor Taniguchi, I came to realize that to assume that something bright, something shining is waiting for us to see down the road in 7 years' time, to assume that had been foreign to me. I belong to the generation that had long thought to have been born into a country of permanent decline. So assuming that the future could be better than the present itself as a concept has been foreign to me. But now I think I can envision, or we can envision, that the future could be at least a little bit brighter than what I thought it would be. And to think that way makes me feel very much glad. And I thought that was one of the best emails that I had ever received in my entire life. In order for you to grow, you really have to have a populace, sustaining population that have enough amount, not too much, not too little, enough amount of self-esteem. And diplomacy sometimes works to sustain the degree of your self-esteem. After all, every one of us wants to share, wants to have a status in which you can be viewed positively by the rest of the world. and Shinzo Abe's diplomacy by covering as many nations as possible and by telling Japan's new narrative to those nations has been successful, I could say, in broadening the psychological space for the Japanese. But this is not the end. Let me just add one other element before closing and opening up the floor. That is that it's been very much important that he is a one-time failed politician. Right? And he did it very much badly, conceivably the worst way. Back in 2007, in September, the first opening day of the session in Japan's parliament called Diet, it's been customary on that first day, the then Prime Minister makes a very much important speech laying out what sort of policies that he's after. It was right after that speech he made, he called upon an urgent press conference and revealed that he couldn't stand and he would have to step down as Prime Minister. What caused his abrupt exit was this Mr. Crohn's disease. He started to develop when he was 18. And he had thought that he would be able to put that Mr. Crohn's disease under control to little avail. On that momentous day of his exit, well, some people say that he had to go to a restroom once in 10, 15 minutes. But something very much interesting happened after that in 2009. One small, mid-sized pharmaceutical company in Japan made a purchase of a specialized pharma company of Switzerland. And that specialized Swiss-based pharma company was the manufacturer of the special drug that could put Mr. Crohn's disease under control. So he started to use this medicine 2 years after he stepped down as Prime Minister, which did a trick. For the first time, imagine, for the first time in your adult life, over a long stretch of 25, 30 years, finally you have started to feel that you are able to put your disease under control, and you feel for the first time, and you are in good shape. And then came this second opportunity for him to grab the Prime Ministership. Which is why I've been arguing that Shinzo Abe may perhaps be called a born-again politician. I think he is. Not in the religious term that George W. Bush was called under, but in a different way. So he gave a clear direction or directive on day one of his administration this time that I, Prime Minister Abe, would like to spend all weekends. On one weekend he said he would like to visit tsunami-stricken area, which he's been doing rather religiously. On another weekend he said he was willing to go to other places in Japan to see how the economy was doing. And on yet another weekend, he said he would be willing to see those people he can't see on weekdays. And you get only one weekend left, and he said he would like to use that weekend for traveling abroad. So to say that you can spend as much time as possible to travel abroad is easy, but exactly to do that has taken a certain amount of guts and dedication, which I think the second term, born-again politician of Shinzo Abe has just happened to have. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have just said, overall, there is no such thing as uniquely Shinzo Abe's foreign policy, but there is a group of elements that have defined and that will continue to define the course Japan's diplomacy ought to take and will likely take. And I have urged you to think about those elements by referring to the situation and circumstances Singapore has been in. And then I have asked you to think of what sort of width and breadth can be in looking at Japan's foreign policy options, or for that matter, economic policy options. And finally, I have mentioned how Shinzo Abe, one can say, has changed from what he used to be. And this ends my initial presentation. For the rest of seminar, I'd be very much interested in listening to your views and comments and questions, and I'd be happy to answer as many questions as you might have.
Thank you, Professor Taniguchi, for your excellent and inspiring talk. I'm sure there will be lots of questions from the floor, but before I open the floor for questions, may I ask rather selfishly you the first question?
Yes.
You have mentioned that, Prime Minister Abe visited many parts of the world, and it is indeed remarkable. And I think many countries, including Singapore, are interested in seeing more initiatives from Japan. But at the same time, recently we hear growing concern about Japanese domestic political issues and also economic issues. For example, the Abenomics was introduced to revive Japanese economy. But at the same time, nowadays we hear some skeptics saying that it is not enough to revive Japanese economy because of the lack of structural reforming plan. And also the increase in consumption tax is also the matter of concern. And last week we also heard the news that two senior cabinet ministers had to resign because of the money scandal. And in a way that reminds me of the first Abe cabinet, where three ministers had to resign for the same reason. So it seems that there are lots of domestic problems at the moment. And I'm just wondering, how confident are you in maintaining Japanese foreign policy initiatives, considering all those domestic challenges?
Thank you, Professor Nakano. The shape of parliamentary diplomacy differs from country to country. The United Kingdom, as many of you may be aware, has long maintained something called Westminster parliamentary democracy, where if you are a winning majority, you can do almost whatever you want to do. It's called winner-take-all situation, which actually is undergoing one of the tremendous changes for the UK history, but that's a different story. In Canada, also parliamentary democracy, there has been an initiative, which actually materialized to give a fixed term to the administration currently in position. That is to say, these sorts of financial scandals, however serious, should not affect the length of term that this Prime Minister can be in office, which obviously is going to be able to give more stability to the nation's political system. But I think in Canada there have been many arguments against this, so it's still ongoing, it's still under debate in Canada. Unfortunately, there is no such thing as fixed political term to be given to any Japanese Prime Minister. What's more, something that the UK does not have exists in Japan. That is to say, the upper chamber of Japanese parliament holds real strength. Unlike in the United Kingdom, the House of Councillors, upper house of Japanese parliament, not only veto power, or power to slow down the economic process, but has an actual power to veto the legislative bills that have passed the lower house. So if you have a twisted situation between the lower and upper houses all the time, you get paralyzed by the either side of the houses, which has competing almost equal amount of power shared by each other. Fortunately, Shinzo Abe, for the first time in many years, was able to amass an enough amount of majority in both houses. So technically, those scandals will come down the road still. And yet, technically, you can say, after all, we have majority in both houses. So, let's just stay calm and wait for those stormy winds to go away. But, it's not that easy. You get newspaper after newspaper that continue to pour out poll results saying that popularity ratings have gone down from the previous 48 to 43, and it's a matter of time for them to go down below 40. Those things will hamper Shinzo Abe's, the course of Shinzo Abe. That's true. About economics, it was very much important for nations cloistered mindset, assuming that nothing substantial could happen to change Japanese economy, assuming that nothing brighter could take place down the road in our future. That cloistered mindset has to be altered, rather, just like this. The first arrow, called dynamic, drastic monetary policy, and the second arrow, that was about dynamic fiscal policy, combined, were able to change terms of trade of the Japanese economy in just a short space of a couple of weeks on the appointment of Shinzo Abe as Prime Minister. And it started to snowball, especially when once again Tokyo won the Olympic Games for 2020. People started to think that all these renovation plans that are going on in Tokyo should serve a given purpose of creating a better, beautiful city. So the long-term projection, something which was a rare commodity rather, in the last 2 decades, has been set in place. Combined, we were able to change and alter the mindset rather in a short space of time. This was of definite necessity. And for that matter, I should give credits to the first and second arrow. Now, the third arrow, one has to say, is the hardest. Because it's not just about demand, it's about the supply side, it's about structural issues. And the structural issues range from, I can't list the issues, agricultural protection, medical practices that are also being under heavy protection, and labor standard, and tax policies, welfare provision, and including more female labor force in the marketplace, in the workplace. All those things are being dealt with, remarkably so. Some people criticize us that you have put too many eggs in a single bento box. It may be true, because these important ingredients of this beautiful bento box may cancel out each other, the result of which is that you may not necessarily be aware how bold some of these may be. But third arrow takes enormous amount of time to materialize, that's for sure. In the meantime, Shinzo Abe's administration is undergoing one of the most testing, or rather taxing literally, periods of its administration, because by the end of this year, Shinzo Abe has to make a decision as to whether or not Japan's sales tax ought to be raised again next year. That is going to be one of the most unpopular yet crucial decisions. If you take into consideration that the government debt, the accumulated amount of which exceeds 230% of the Japanese economy. And in the meantime, soon you will have one of the most crucial, again, regional elections to choose the governor for Okinawa. The current incumbent governor spent many years before coming along with Shinzo Abe to agree upon the plan to relocate one of the air base of the U.S. Marine Corps from a densely populated area to a coastal area. And then the winning of the opposition candidate may put this whole process to square one. So that's going to be one of the most important regional elections. Come next year, a series of regional elections are due also. And in the meantime, still, you must choose one nuclear reactor after another to get reactivated without a still lingering massive amount of concerns, I shouldn't say oppositions. There are activists who are staunchly opposed to central government reactivating these nuclear reactors, but you must put everything into balance, because each and every day the Japanese economy as a whole is losing a massive amount of money merely to buy fossil fuel from abroad. And so from the safest possible nuclear reactor, I think it is legitimate for that to be reactivated one by one. But this also despite a massive amount of public concerns. So, in short, Shinzo Abe's administration is undergoing a very much testing period. And how best can he survive is an open-ended question, but I think his resolve and sheer, once again, dedication to working, this is very much a gung-ho Japanese-like business style, you may say, is the one that Shinzo Abe and his right-hand man of Chief Cabinet Secretary, someone called Suga, are adopting, attempting to use for the administration to survive and then deliver those policies.
Thank you, Professor Taniguchi. Now, I would like to open the question. The question. Okay, so one from her, and then gentleman over there.
Professor Taniguchi, Lam Ping from the East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore. I really enjoyed your very elegant presentation, and by and large, I am persuaded by your comments. I have two short observations and one question. You mentioned about the dynamism of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo flying the flag, visiting 49 countries. I mean, that is certainly quite incredible. But then again, it is so glaring that he has yet to visit South Korea and China. So that's my first observation. Even if he were to visit China for the APEC meeting, it is still quite glaring when the Prime Minister of Japan has difficulties visiting Japan's immediate neighbor. So that's the first observation. Second observation, you mentioned that in foreign policy, very often foreign policy of many countries, including Japan, is marked by continuity rather than a radical change. And you mentioned that even for Prime Minister Noda from a different ruling party and Prime Minister Abe, there isn't really any significant rupture or difference in foreign policy. I think that is definitely true. But then again, we can also see certain differences. China-Japan relations were really rocky even during the days of Prime Minister Noda. He nationalized the islands. But that's one marked difference between DPJ government and the present LDP government. One difference I can think of is Abe's ideological orientation. Okay? And his insistence on visiting Yasukuni Shrine. Okay, I know that is his personal credo. The domestic politics of Japan is involved. But at the same time, from the perception of the Chinese and Koreans, Yasukuni Shrine is a symbol of Japanese imperialism. Okay, so that's a significant difference. Okay, now back to my single question. You mentioned about Chinese naval ambition, and arguably the greatest challenge to Japanese foreign policy is how to deal with the rising China. So I'll be very appreciative if you can share with us your personal views, your candid views, your personal views, not the official take on the Abe administration, but your personal view on how Japan should coexist with China. How should Japan deal with rising China? Thank you.
So I've heard three observations, comments. One, Japan, China, Japan, Seoul, Japan, Korea. And two, Abe's ideology about things like Yasukuni. And three, China's ambition. How can I make of that? What can I make of that? If you have any two-figure question to add these three questions or comments, can I hear those? Okay? Yes.
Good evening, Professor. I'm Calvin from the Ministry of Trade and Industry. I need to add on to what Prof. Lam has mentioned. I think, in particular, what we have seen is that it's not just at the political level that the worsening relations between China and Japan, but it's actually affected Japanese investment in China. And that seems to be something that is quite distinct during the Abe administration. In fact, the Chinese has also made it very personal in a way. They have actually allowed Xi Jinping to actually meet former Prime Minister Fukuda, and not just once, but twice. So I think the Chinese has already made it become very personal. So I'm just wondering how much of this is actually because of Prime Minister Abe, or is it just a continuation of Japanese strategic interests? Thank you.
Thank you very much. While trying to answer these not easy questions, please spend your time to come up with even more difficult questions, right? Your question, sir, is among relatively the easiest for me to answer, because it's not so much Abe factor as the changes in Chinese economy itself that have affected the minds of Japanese business leaders. The Chinese economy is no longer a place where you can recruit the cheapest possible labor force. Indeed, the labor cost, as you are well aware, in China has gotten significantly higher. And in the meantime, Vietnam, Cambodia, neighboring nations even have got a pair of shoes made in Myanmar. You know, those industries are growing. So there has been a remarkably smaller appetite amount shared by the Japanese leaders to further invest into China. This is not divesting from China, but when it comes to making further investments in China, I think I have to say there has been a far smaller amount of appetite among the Japanese business leaders. And poll after, I've seen a couple polls about this. to judge the attitudes or the changes in their attitudes vis-a-vis China. One of those questions asked, you have seen Panasonic factory broken into ashes by the mobs in China. You have seen a Japanese retail chain store also broken by a mob in China. Did it affect your investment policy towards China? And very few answered yes. So it's more a matter of calculation about cost that's affected the way in which Japanese leaders, business leaders choose their investment destinations. And India has gotten larger mind share, Vietnam also. So China has to compete with many other nations in order to still draw new green field investment from abroad. That's my answer to you. And China-Japan relationship. What's going to be interesting for us to see, for you to see as well, will be what will happen on the sidelines of the APEC meeting due in November in Beijing. Beijing has extended letters of invitation to all the members of the APEC, including, of course, Japan. And there is a growing likelihood, I wouldn't say 100% likelihood, for Xi Abe to meet on the sidelines of the APEC and certainly shake hands with each other, exchange smiles. What kind of smiles will they be? I'm going to be interested in watching the TV screen to detect any small signs. But some people say it's not just going to be, it's going just going to be a photo of it, nothing more. My response would be, so be it, for the three reasons that follow. One, if you have the peak of pyramid, respectively, speaking with each other, the lower layers of the government will resume their normal dialogues with their counterparts, which have not taken place, despite, this is Japanese view, so please discount, despite our continued call to do so. So I would assume that ministries of industry, ministries of education on both sides will start again talking about impending issues with each other. For instance, how best to protect investments that Japan has made in China, or vice versa, has not been talked about for many months and years. Those dialogues will resume. That's one. Number two, a photo opportunity itself can send an important signal across the globe that, tension is gradually subsiding in East Asia. And it's a positive message for both countries, China and Japan. So this is a win-win situation. And especially for Japan, which has paid a certain amount of effort and time to get itself closer to countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and so on. I think it will be important for these countries, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Australia, India, you name it, not to feel that their closeness with Japan should work to the detriment of their own relationships with China. So, in that sense, this photo op can send a very much important signal. Third, the Chinese propaganda machine is awesome. It's budgets that you can use solely, for instance, for CCTV America, outnumbers that of the total amount BBC World Service can use. So there is no match. I, as a member of the, let's say, perception management team for the Japanese government, especially for Shinzo Abe,
Well, I will take a deep sigh of relief if Xi Jinping can say to the lower echelon of his government, let's halt. Let's, for the moment, not push Japan, try to push Japan into court, right? So, that may be another byproduct that Xi Jinping and Abe meeting could bring about. What about Korea? Unlike China-Japan relationship, there was an occasion, I have to say, organized by Barack Obama, mediated by Barack Obama, let me put it that way, for Park Geun-hye and Shinzo Abe to meet. And Shinzo Abe, I can say, is a hard worker, remembering Korean phrase. Before meeting Park Geun-hye, he tried to remember and be able to say by memory his introduction and how nice it is for him to meet Park Geun-hye finally. And he did it in Korean rather well. But Park Geun-hye was using a different channel in her simultaneous translating machine. So all these Korean words Shinzo Abe said did not get translated actually, and were not audible in the ear of Park Geun-hye. Those missteps, unfortunate missteps, were many in the examples. But this may be my wishful thinking, but already people in South Korea in a growing number have started to say that we must have a wider scope in dealing with the Japanese. Again, this may be my wishful thinking. So after Xi-Abe meeting has taken place, one should hope Park Geun-hye, President Park, could come out and say, let's discuss. So that's about China, Korea, Japan. About Yasukuni. I, for one, do not believe and have not believed that Shinzo Abe pays homage to, for instance, General Tojo. And I have not to forget that Japan has owed Singapore a lot, because Singapore has been among the first nations where Japan's brutality during the war still is being remembered vividly, but nonetheless has chosen to work with Japan. Australia is another example. Shinzo Abe's grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, went to Australia when he was in office, primarily to amass political capital before his meeting with Dwight Eisenhower back in 1957. Well, this may look a little bit similar to what Shinzo Abe is now doing, because he's been going to many other places, Australia, India, Malaysia, Singapore, and the European nations as well, and actually amassing his own political capital before meeting his difficult partner, namely Xi Jinping. But that aside, there was a long time serving prime minister in Australia. Someone from Australia in the room? Tell us who the longest serving prime minister was.
Robert Menzies.
Menzies. Prime Minister Menzies, when he met Nobusuke Kishi, very movingly said, let's just not remember everything about, let's just not remember all the time the past. Let's just start talking more about the future. This is 1957. And in his speech, Shinzo Abe gave to the Joint House of the Congress, he said how appreciated he has been. Who were we? But there is one thing in common between his grandfather Kishi, who is his maternal grandfather, and his paternal grandfather, Mr. Abe, grandfather Mr. Abe, who was also, at the time, a member of the parliament under the wartime government in Japan. Both these men, Kishi, grandfather Kishi, and grandfather Abe, did have different political orientations and views, but had just one thing in common, that his grandfather, Kishi, as being a member of the Tojo cabinet, said that he couldn't get along well with the prime minister himself. There was a policy difference between Kishi and Tojo. So he chose to step down as Minister of Economy and Trade, which brought about an eventual dissolution of Tojo's cabinet, which gave an end mark to Tojo's rule during the wartime. And this Abe, grandfather Abe, was a lone wolf, the sole, only presence, single presence, that did not agree with the conformist policy agendas, then a little bit Nazi-like coalition that was taking shape during the wartime in Japan. So I think Shinzo Abe is the last person who pays homage to General Tojo. And I think given the encyclopedic knowledge, I have to say, Shinzo Abe has amassed about Japan's wartime records, I don't think he says that Japan's deeds, Japan's actions that Japanese military did throughout this region were justifiable. After all, more people, more members of the Japanese military died from hunger, from tropical disease, not from exchange of brutality and hostility. It was a clear indication that how bad the wartime leadership was, how ill-prepared the Japanese wartime leadership was. I have my own father who was a member of the Japanese military. He passed away many years ago, but Shinzo Abe and I belong to more or less the same generation. And I'm not in no mood interested in justifying those brutal records in Japanese military, or wrongdoings, or bad leadership that prevailed during the wartime. And damage done by the visit Shinzo Abe made to Yasukuni was considerable, I must admit, because that was the time when the uniformed assault using in full throttle the Chinese propaganda machine against the Japanese became very much awesome. And it was like trying to shoot a moving target. And given the short amount of war chest that the Japanese government is able to use, it was almost beyond anyone's imagination. But anyway, January, February, March, Tokyo hosted a strikingly big number of visitors from Washington, D.C. And they were members of Congress, aides working for the members of Congress, think tank people, people from private equity funds, hedge funds, and so on. They all were in Tokyo for a single same purpose, to test the pulse, take the pulse and blood pressure of Japan in general and of Shinzo Abe in particular. And for this to happen, a magnetic presence of the most famous ambassador the United States has ever had in Japan, but arguably in any other country, namely Caroline Kennedy, helped, because a lot of them wanted to be in Japan, certainly to take the pulse of what was going on, but also to get photographed sitting next to the, let's say, celebrity ambassador of Caroline. And I think many people coming that way to Japan went back home to Washington, D.C. with a more or less similar message that Shinzo Abe may be bloody conservative. And yet, he is the person that we Americans can still work with. After all, his commitment in many defenses with the United States, investing further into the alliance, trying to boost Japanese economy, is there and real. And so long as Japan is a close ally to the United States, we still can and have to deal with this man Shinzo Abe. I think that may have been, I would imagine, a unified sort of message that these men brought back to Washington, D.C., without which, I would imagine, President Barack Obama would not have made an endorsement of the fact that the security alliance between the two nations is extended or should cover the territories, senkakus. That was the first time ever for any U.S. president to openly say that the alliance treaty covers those islands. Now, I'll stop here, and I'm not sure if I've answered all your questions.
China-Japan relations.
China-Japan relationship. What specifically was it?
How do you think Japan should deal with the rights?
Ah, yes. It's in more general terms. I think that's the question that many of us cannot forget throughout our lifetime, short, long, whatever. And there is no clear-cut answer I could imagine for that question. Because China, for me, seems to represent a box of unknown factors. I would be very much curious as to know whether the top leaders of the country themselves can clearly say that this is the China that we can envision coming to shape in 10 years' time. So, again, with that degree of uncertainties, I think one thing that countries like Japan can do is once again to talk, certainly with the Chinese, and to bind yourself more firmly with like-minded colleagues, friends, allies of yours. I think that's what the Japanese can do and are being done under Shinzo Abe's administration as well.
Any other question? Yes.
I'm Suryanarayan from the Institute of South Asian Studies here at the National University of Singapore, and formerly I was a journalist for Indian newspaper in the Asia Pacific correspondent. So you have categorically said that Japan will continue to count on the US security canopy, but you also said that Japan would like to diversify security ties, say with Australia, India, and Indonesia. With India in particular, what is that Japan is likely to do in terms of security cooperation? Is it just maritime security cooperation, or is it something beyond that with reference to China, for instance? And secondly, if you don't mind, what do you think are the prospects of Japan-India civil nuclear cooperation factory finalized? Thank you.
I get lots of questions about India-Japan civil nuclear pact that is being discussed and soon to take shape. I think it's a matter of time. It's not a matter of whether or not. And there is a there is a imbalance between the amount of interest paid to this single issue by the Japanese and by the Indians. And the Indians are very much keen on getting an answer, clear-cut prediction of how soon. But I think it's been progressing, and it's to do with the red tape, not on either one of the sides, but on both sides. The Japanese government is insisting on having an opportunities to look into related factories that India has, so that they can be 100% sure that important technologies should not be flowed from that factory to someone else. So that sort of verification process is what I hear the Japanese side insists on, to meet a certain degree of hesitation from the Indian side. You know, it's not something that we should spend so much time about, because it's an ongoing process, and it's very much a cumbersome bureaucrat sort of issue. Now, the United States is the largest shareholder of Japan. If Japan were a company, this is like a metaphor. And Japan, when it was a very small country, relatively speaking, this is about the 1950s. The United States, arguably, might have been the single biggest shareholder for Japan. But Japan's scope obviously has grown much wider over the last several decades, and the United States also has a wider scope of interests in this part of the world. And many pundits, an increasing number of strategic thinkers in the United States now argue that now is the time for the United States to shift our military doctrine from one based on hub-spoke model to something based on networked model, whereby the ends of those spokes that have not spoken with each other that much, that have not cooperated with each other, may be able to collaborate more intensely with each other, thereby creating a network itself, which is the case, I think, given what's been going on between Australia and Japan, between Singapore and Japan, and between, as you say, India and Japan. Why can Japan think it can cooperate better with India? Sometimes geography once again matters. You are faced with the Indian Ocean, but you also have an archipelago directly faced with the Straits of Malacca, Andaman Nicobar Islands, with which India can claim you are a full-fledged integral partner of the Southeast Asian framework. And you are actually in the course of rediscovering the strategic value thereof. And then Japan has been and will continue to be among the biggest stakeholders of the safety of the Straits of Malacca, and in general the safe passage of these waters. So there is ample room for India and Japan to cooperate. What's more, India has proven to be a very much sustainable democracy, even though a little bit rumsy one. But no matter what, election after election, your election committee in India the biggest of its kind in humankind's history, has been remarkably able to manage all these elections. So, the track record of India being an age-old democracy has been able to give a source of confidence to the Japanese. You cannot underestimate this ingredient, let alone our mutual affections to each other. There is no skeleton whatsoever in the closet, either in India or in Japan. And ladies and gentlemen, there is a country in the world, only country in the world, whose legislative body gives a moment of silence each and every day on the 6th or 9th of August, either to commemorate the war dead under Hiroshima's bombing or Nagasaki. That's India. So, I think it's a growing relationship, personal chemistry also. Narendra Modi, Shinzo Abe have been extremely good. So was between Singh and Abe previously. Okay, next question please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very engaging speech. I'd like to ask one quick question about the Prime Minister Abe's diplomacy. It's getting really, really active, and you touched on the role of the EAS, East Asia Summit. And then whenever I saw the news was some kind of the broadcasting, Abe seems to me like Abe emphasized the lots of the importance of EAS. And then he actually mentioned that he wants to make the EAS as a strategic forum in the East Asia. But I'm not sure like what it means. And then in your view, like what actually like Prime Minister Abe wants to do with the EAS.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for sharing with us your views. I have a question relating to TTT. Now, it was the Noda administration that announced Japan's participation in the talks. So right now it's the Abe's government that has to see Japan through the last mile talks. Do you think that there is political will for Abe's government to, to complete the talks?
I think the gentleman over there. Lady over there.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about immigration, and just you mentioned about the Japan has to improve the labor productivity, and you mentioned about also alleviating the problems for female laborers, but you didn't mention about immigration. And just recently I saw the statistics, and towards 2030, just Japan's young labor forces population declining very quickly, whereas the United States, UK, it's increasing actually. It's because of immigration. So I want to have your view for that.
I think the gentleman.
Sir, thanks very much. One of the things, I agree with your assessment on the continuity between the Noda government and the Abe government, but one of the things I think we did see a bit is a disconnect between alliance managers on the U.S. side and the Japanese side. I was going to say, do you see any concern in that? Because I think on the U.S. side, a lot of people thought productive work took place under the Noda government, but then transition, there's almost a feeling of, hey, what took place was unimportant, it's about future direction. I think there's sometimes some of the work being done in that time was discounted. And it's concerning if you also take that with the most recent Congressional Research Service report saying that some of Prime Minister Abe's actions have been detrimental to U.S. interests, worry about concerns about gaps in the alliance. Could you speak to that, please? Thank
you. East Asia Summit, EAS, TPP, immigration, and alliance management. East Asian Summit, as I said at the beginning, couldn't have materialized without Singapore and Japan cooperating closely with each other. with an idea that it should become a prime venue for political dialogue. For that very purpose, Singapore, Japan shared the same commitment to including important partners like Australia, India, and New Zealand. The result of which has given the East Asia Summit democratic credit, democratic openness, and democratic credentials, more so than other institutions. No single institutional build-up effort in Japan, in Asia, can solve the range of issues that we are faced with. Maybe it's because in Europe, there was very much a strong entity called USSR and its satellites, and the fault line was clearer than is the case in Asia. Therefore, there may have been attempts like OSCE, but Asia's story is much, much more different. And I cannot envision which one is going to prevail and which one is going to cease to exist and so on and so forth. But what's important is for the regional institution to remain as wide-ranging and politically legitimate and inclusive. And to the EAS, the United States of America can send its president, whereas ASEAN plus 305 dialogues, they can't. So EAS, Japan hopes very much, is going to develop as, again, a primary platform for future political dialogues. And one should emphasize, this is not Abe's quote-unquote policy. It's very much a bipartisan policy that's been sought since the advent of EAS. That's my answer to the gentleman that posed this question about EAS. And TPP. Let me remind you that in the history of U.S. trade liberalization talks to create FTA-like institutions, there is only one precedent that materialized without it being supported by what is called Trade Promotion Authority, previously known as Fast Track Arrangement, whereby the Congress give a broad endorsement to whatever the President or the executive branch does on the trade front. TPP is the second such exception that has not been supported, backed by TPA, Trade Promotion Authority. So from the beginning, it's been widely known that when it comes to the stage of completing negotiations, the United States side may feel under tremendous pressure, which for me seems to have been the case. But we're heading towards the election day, 4th of November, and what sort of results the coming elections will have, I don't know, but one can hope the situation is going to get clearer still. there is a political will on the part of Japan. When Tokyo made an announcement, or rather Shinzo Abe made an announcement back in February last year to joining the negotiation process of the TPP, it actually caused surprises on the part of the United States. Many people in the United States had long thought that given the difficulty of trade liberalization, Shinzo Abe might well put it into back burner until after the impending elections for the upper house. But Shinzo Abe said that. And another indicator that evinces his political will is the fact that Japan finally has been able to forge a broad economic partnership agreement, which is an enhanced form of free trade agreement with one of the biggest agro-exporting countries in the world, namely Australia. Australia-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement is now complete, only to be waiting to be endorsed by the respective legislative body. And the hope was to use this fact that Japan and Australia are now tied with free trade agreement to give further boost to the TPP negotiation process. And having looked at TPP negotiation facing difficulties, it was also Shinzo Abe who chose to tell his European colleagues, like David Cameron, that within 2015, a broad agreement ought to be cut between the EU and Japan about free trade, or EPA. So he's trying to use these two different channels in order to give a boost to the TPP. Time may look running out, given the fact that many people, including President Obama, have long said that this year, within this year, we must complete the trade dialogue. How soon can we do that? I don't know, but I still maintain that there is a will for Japan. Let me just put another element or two before moving on to the alliance issue, that the announcement that Japan should join the negotiation itself created an interesting couple of byproducts. One is this abrupt shift of focus to Japan's agriculture from an object of getting protections or subsidies from the central government to viewing the same industry as a potential growth generator to be transformed to exporting industry. So the Japanese agricultural co-op is working hard to enhance exportation. But in the meantime, this agricultural cooperative, which itself was an embodiment of vested interests, which, by the way, were hotbeds for conservative votes, is itself undergoing a tremendous change because they must give up their monopoly in both procurement and sales of agricultural-related products. This is unprecedented. Rice farmers are going to give up the long-held subsidy schemes in a gradual fashion over the next 5 years. This sort of shift in Japanese agricultural policy has never hit the headlines of international media. Nonetheless, I should emphasize, bear very much important significance for Japan's industrial history. And that couldn't have occurred without Japan announcing its will to enter the TPP. So let me just move on to the final issue of alliance management. And you talked about the new report issued by the CRS. Yes, it's an important report, but I should say, with due respect to the researchers and scholars that are working at the CRS, not necessarily the alliance policy, especially for the Pentagon and White House, have been taking those reports into consideration. Alliance management under NODA started to work more effectively. But one could argue that the damage done previously by the previous Prime Minister to the existing plan was so harmful that it took many efforts from both sides to fix it. I think that was the situation which we saw between NODA and then Barack Obama administration. Certainly, Abe came into office making a pledge that the long-standing stalemate even issue of the base relocation, given the fact that the presence of the U.S. Marine Corps will carry significance in the future, must be the focal point from the beginning for the Abe administration in terms of U.S.-Japan alliance management. So he put a lot of emphasis on speaking with the prefecture's governor, Okinawa's governor, and finally at the end of last year, December, the combined effort made by a lot of people, not just the central government, but also the party, both the LDP and its coalition partner, Komeito, culminated in the decision the Okinawa governor made that he would endorse the plan as is to relocate the Futenma Air Base to another new base on shore. So, that being the single most important detrimental factor that had continued to actually damage U.S.-Japan relationship. To solve that issue, I would say, has given a new amount of investment into the U.S.-Japan alliance. I have never thought, actually, that U.S.-Japan alliance management has gotten a little bit weaker under the current dynamics. Quite the opposite is the sense that I get. Yes. If you have the last two-finger question, I would like to take that before closing. Oh, your question was?
Immigration.
Oh, immigration, sorry. I forgot to answer your question. I can tell you that Japan is not going to be like Singapore. Japan is not not going to be like Australia or the United States in a matter of years, right? That said, my wife just happens to be an instructor of Japanese language to the Filipinos, Indonesians, Chinese, Taiwanese, sometimes Americans living in our local district. And it's not just about Tokyo, the populated area of Japan. If you go to local cities, rural areas even, no village exists without an increasing number of foreigners. Everything is relative. I would say nothing dramatic in your eyes may have happened in Japan, but in relative terms, Japan of today is nothing like Japan of the 1960s or 70s. So things are on their way under the ongoing process. Now, let me say that events and tasks and I should say imperatives about the importance of rebuilding the nation's economy have been so much as to push Shinzo Abe's administration to take more open postures, to be more even progressive in many respects. The gender issue is a typical example of that. Hardly a day goes by, I'm not exaggerating, hardly a day goes by without you hearing Shinzo Abe speaking out loud on behalf of women. It's almost like he is making an advocacy. Japan ought to be the place where women should shine. One interesting byproduct is shine is spelled S-H-I-N-E. For those of you who have learned Japanese romanized alphabets, it sounds shine. Well, so it was made fun of, but that's a different story. And you have to think hard about what sort of societal, institutional arrangements you may want to have. If you want to have an increasing number of aspiring female workers, working almost, 9 to 23, long hours. Yes, you must provide them with baby care facilities, child care facilities for elementary school kids, but also you would like to have a nanny. And who can provide domestic care service better than the Philippines, Indonesia? So we're talking now about increasing the number of those people from abroad. So far, in theory, Japanese policy has been done in such a way as to restrict the qualification of the people interested in coming to Japan as people bearing professional credentials of some sort. And that's going to be loosened. So you have to change your regime from this qualification system to a number management system. And what sort of outcome you must envision down the road, I have to say, is yet to be hotly debated, but sooner rather than later, the nation will face that sort of question.
Thank you, Professor Taniguchi. I'm afraid time is running out, so I have to close this session. Please help me to thank Professor Taniguchi for his wonderful talk.